Okay, if you have a Bible, Hebrews chapter 3. Hebrews chapter 3 is our text here this evening, and we're going to advance our way through Hebrews chapter 3. And I don't know how far we'll make it. I mean, the section that I have there on the screen, that is kind of our next, it's next on the agenda, is to get from Hebrews 3 verse 7 to the end of the chapter, verse 19. Now, it's a one pretty continuous flow of thought, and we can make a little quicker progress, but we'll see. I don't know if we'll make it all the way through it tonight, but that's okay if we do or don't. But we are kind of at another hinge point in the book. Recall just with me briefly the nature of the book of Hebrews, that it is, recall the style and structure to the book, that back in the kind of the tail end of the book of Hebrews, we talked about it in the introduction, but in Hebrews 13:22, the book is called or labeled a word of exhortation. Now, this particular Greek word, if you would recall, appears only 2 times in the whole New Testament, Hebrews 13 and Acts 13, and it refers to a synagogue homily or a sermon. Now, because the book of Hebrews is essentially a sermon, then it is built like a sermon in a couple of different ways. First of all, you see there is an alternation between explanation and exhortation. You recall this, that the book of Hebrews is going to go back and forth between, number one, explaining the supremacy of Christ, but then exhorting us to act in a particular way that would be appropriate with an understanding of the supremacy of Christ. So he's going to go back and forth because it's a sermon. It's a persuasive speech. That's the idea. So he's going to explain the supremacy of Christ, but then he's going to exhort us to follow Christ. And the exhortation passages, as they're sometimes called, or also known as the warning passages, are scattered throughout the book of Hebrews, and there's 5 of them. We've already studied the first one. That was in chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. Well, tonight we're going to begin our examination of the second one. And this is the list that I've given to you before, but chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, is essentially a warning passage urging us to act. With this phrase, it says, let us give the more earnest heed. And that is, don't drift from the word. That was kind of the way we summarized that warning passage in chapter 2. Chapter 3, verse 7, and this is a long one. It's going to extend from chapter 3, verse 7, really all the way to chapter 4, verse 13. And we can't cover all that tonight, obviously, but we're going to see it's a rather extensive warning passage, which is basically built around there's more than one command, but it says, let us strive to enter that rest is one of the main commands that it climaxes with in chapter 4. As we'll see tonight, we have a command to hold fast to the confidence with rejoicing, and we'll talk about that here this evening. But this is the second warning passage that we're on the threshold of studying here this evening. And then in due time, we'll get to the next 3. Chapter 5, verse 11 to 6:20, chapter 10, and then chapter 12. We have 3 more warning passages coming. But what we are looking at here this evening is we're going to begin our examination of the second warning passage, which again, it's seamlessly woven into the fabric of the sermon of the book of Hebrews, where he goes from arguing, if you recall not last week, because I was gone last week, 2 weeks ago, the last time we were in the book of Hebrews, we examined chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. Now, don't forget that. Let's connect these thoughts just briefly. But in chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, the beginning of chapter 3, that paragraph compared and contrasted Christ with Moses. Yet, it ended with a condition. And we actually did not get to that last time. And so that's where we're going to pick it up today, is we actually have to pick up the pieces, kind of summarize where we left off, but spend some time camping in verse 6 so that we can have, the setting that we need to jump into the warning section. But recall that first paragraph was basically a defense of the supremacy of Christ over Moses. And we don't need to go back and recreate that whole argument, but the point is, that was the big point being made in that paragraph. Jesus is better than Moses. He is worthy of greater glory than Moses. And then he says in verse 6, but Christ as a son over his own house, whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope firm to the end. In other words, Christ is greater than Moses, because Moses is merely a servant within the household of God, but Christ is the Son in the household of God. And we are part of his household if, and there's the condition, if we hold fast the confidence and rejoicing of the hope firm to the end. And so this next paragraph, or that we're getting into, chapter 3, verses 7 and following, what it's going to do is it's going to grant to us the negative example to this command. In other words, we are part of the family of God if we hold fast. So then he's going to give us an example of a group of people that did not do that. He's going to give us a negative example. People that did not hold fast to the Lord. Rather, they refused to believe in him. And he's going to talk about the wilderness generation, right, of Israel. Comes out of the nation of Egypt in the Exodus. And they would not enter in the land of Canaan. They would not trust God. And so as a result, they die in the wilderness. And so he's going to talk about that generation, and he's going to use them as the primary negative example of what we ought not do or ought not be. And that's the kind of this next chunk that we're going to look at, chapter 3, verses 7 to 19. And so that's where we're heading. But recall verse 6 in context. Verse 6 in particular serves to apply the concepts of the faithfulness of Christ and Moses to the original audience. In other words, recall, and again, we're kind of dipping back into what we talked about a couple weeks ago, but he's talking about the faithfulness of Moses. That was great. But the faithfulness of Christ was greater. But the theme of the supremacy of Christ is built around the fact that he's faithful. The faithfulness of Christ is really one of the bedrock ideas of that first paragraph. Well, that's then his springboard to become practical. If Christ was faithful, and you are to be part of the household of Christ, then, excuse me, sorry, my clicker's skipping on me. There we go. Then what it's doing is, verse 6 is setting the scene for the next paragraph. It serves to set the scene and grant the negative example, but what he's going to do is he's going to say, if Christ is faithful, then you too ought be faithful. If you are to be part of his household, if you are to be like Christ, then you must also exhibit faithfulness. And so he's going to build upon that. So verse 6 is kind of a swing to the swing verse, a hinge point, if you will, to the entire chapter. So again, verse 7 to 3:7 to 4:13, this whole long warning passage, which spans almost 2 whole chapters, is going to warn us to not repeat the failures of the first Exodus generation. And let me give you the big thought flow of where we're going. He's going to say that you basically don't be like them, but he's going to do it by quoting Psalm 95. And if you don't remember that, that's okay. We're going to go back and read it. Okay, we talked through Psalm 95 in our Psalter series, but we'll go back and we'll reread that section so we can kind of regain our bearings. But he's going to quote Psalm 95 in verses 9 to 11, and then he's going to basically use that as a warning to say, okay, don't repeat the failures of the Exodus generation, that generation that refused to believe God. Though they were delivered by God from Egypt in the Exodus, yet they refused to trust God and go into the land of Canaan. And so the warning passage from chapter 3 to chapter 4 is big, but I find it helpful to subdivide it into two big ideas, two big parts. Chapter 3, verses 7 to 19, is going to warn us against the results of unbelief. Don't be unbelieving. But then, chapter 4 is going to shift a little bit to be a little bit more of a positive tone. And he's going to say, enter into God's rest. They, the children of Israel, would not enter into the land of Canaan, but he's going to then use them as an idiom, an illustration for our experience in the Christian life. He says we are to enter into the rest that God has designed for us. And so he's going to give us basically a negative example, a warning, chapter 3, and then kind of a reward, a promise of blessing, chapter 4. All right, so that's kind of the big thought flow of this warning passage, if that makes sense. And I'm just giving you a 30,000-foot, bird's eye view, if you will, and we will get into the details as we go. But with that said, let's reread verse 6, all right? And let's try and camp on verse 6 for a minute, because we really didn't get to this verse last time, and it's really important because it's, the hinge to this next section. But It says, but Christ as a son, again, contrast being between Christ and Moses, but Christ as a son over his own house, whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence and rejoicing of the hope firm to the end. Now, what is fascinating is that verse 6 right there, this is where we ended last time, if you remember. I know it was a couple weeks ago, but try and remember with me. This is where we ended, was that verse 6 actually inserts a comfort to the readers. It says that you are of the family, the household of God. And remember, this is where we ended, but to this original Jewish audience, how appropriate of a comfort, a line of comfort that is. Because again, think about this. Remember the original context. These are Jews that are suffering because they are Christians. Remember this? And so because they're suffering as Christians, they are tempted to revert back to Judaism. Now, that's kind of one of the big ideas you got to keep in your mind as we're reading through. And so we talked about the pain of being rejected by family. And some of y'all have some pretty, realistic personal examples of going through something like that, where because of your faith in Christ, you are alienated by the rest of your family. And how tragic that is. And that's what these Jews were going through. But their entire Jewish identity and their social network was rejecting them because they were embracing Christ. And so it's obvious for them to be tempted to say, well, maybe it's not so bad to go back to Judaism, to not say Jesus is the Messiah, but we'll kind of go back to the temple, we'll go back to the temple sacrifices, and it's easier to do that so that we don't have to endure, the persecution, etc. So the author of Hebrews is basically arguing and saying, no, don't do that. Let me convince you that Jesus is better. But then along the way, he's also going to drop little nuggets and basically say, listen, Christ is better, and there are rewards, both temporally and eternally, for being a believer in Christ. In other words, it is worth it. That's his persuasive speech is trying to convince them that it is worth it to be a Christian. And one of the things that he uses is this phrase, that you are of the household of God. Now, we're going to camp on that a little bit more because the chapter is going to come back to that idea later in chapter 3. But he's basically saying that the Jews who reject Jesus, they just assume, remember John the Baptist in his sermon, to shake up the Jewish leadership? He says, don't say to me that we're sons of Abraham, because God can make of these very stones sons to Abraham. What in the world is he talking about? He was trying to confront them in their Jewishness because many of them, not all, but many of them had gotten to the point that they believed that they were safe. Because they were Jewish, they were God's chosen people. They could do no wrong, that they were going to be fine. They were God's chosen people. And so John the Baptist and Jesus after him had to shake them to an awareness that no, you need to make a personal decision to follow Jesus as Messiah. And if you reject him, yeah, you're still a Jew, but you just forfeited being part of the household of God. Does that make sense? So it's really, that idea is going to be really central to this part of the argument here in the book of Hebrews, but the author is trying to basically take the Jewish charge, Jewish against Christian charge, that these Christians were leaving the family of God because they were trusting Jesus, that they were becoming Christian. Christians aren't Jews, and we're kicking you out of being Jews, and so you have left the family of God. And the author of Hebrews is saying, no. You are the real family of God, and those Jews who reject Jesus as Messiah, they are outside of the family of God. Does that make sense? He's trying to build the case in reverse. And so, with that said, however, as he offers that comfort to them, you are part of this family of God, he then gives it a condition. He says, if you hold fast. Now, we got to talk about this condition, because he's going to build the rest of his warning passage, chapter 3, verse 7, all the way to chapter 4, verse 13, is built around this idea. This is our hinge point. He says that you are of the family of God if we hold fast the confidence and rejoicing of the hope firm to the end. Now, this idea pervades the book of Hebrews. Go to chapter 4, verse 14. All right, we just read, well, actually, I skipped one. We just read 3:6. Read 3:14, and then we'll go to 4:14. Look at 3:6, we just read, but now 3:14. He says, for we are made partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. Now go to chapter 4, verse 14. He says, seeing then that we have a great high priest that has passed into the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. And then, of course, this idea of holding fast also surfaces in chapter 10. Hebrews 10 and verse 23, he says, let us hold fast to the profession of our faith without wavering, for he is faithful that promised. In other words, 4 times in the book, he uses this particular phrase, but then there's another half a dozen ways he says this same thing. Like we've already looked at one back in chapter 2 when he says, don't drift away, don't slip away. Remember this? But the idea is he is encouraging them to hold fast or don't slip away from faith in Christ. And this is the condition of their salvation. So let's build on this. What is he talking about? Well, again, connect the thoughts. Being of the household of God means that we should reflect the builder. In other words, like father, like son. Only those who reflect the faithfulness of the faithful Christ can properly be called family. That makes sense? It says, if you are of the family of God, here's the dead giveaway. You are holding fast to the profession. If you're not holding fast to the profession, that's the giveaway that you're not of the family of God. Does that make sense? He's drawing a line in the sand. And he says the family of God's on this side, and everybody else is on that side. And what makes you part of the family of God, or the mark of a true believer, is holding fast to your profession. So, with that said, I want to summarize. All right, this is a whole outline in its own self. And feel free to pause, slow me down if you got questions, comments. But I want to give you what I call the vital signs of a believer from beginning to ending. And there's just 3 of them. It's this nice, nifty little 3-point outline, But the vital signs of a believer, what does that mean? It means signs of life. You ever, vital signs? We got some EMS people. My dad was EMT. My brother was an EMT, right? And the whole idea is you take your vitals. What's that mean, right? Well, you check pulse, you check heart rate, blood pressure, all that stuff. And you're looking for signs of life. What are the vital signs of a believer? How do we know who is a believer and who is not? Now, ultimately, let me just give the caveat, and elsewhere in the scripture it says this very clearly, that ultimately God knows them that are his. 2 Timothy 2. That from the human perspective, we can't always tell, can we? Who is a true Christian and who is not. However, there are clear vital signs that the Bible gives to us, and Hebrews summarizes so succinctly, that we should be looking for. That if these are not present, then we have a reasonable grounds to doubt someone's salvation. All right? So what are they? Well, let me give you 3 of them. Number 1, profession. Number 2, progression. Number 3, perseverance. What does that mean? Throughout the book of Hebrews, the author is going to say we need to hold fast to our profession. He says that in 3:1, 4:14, and 10:23. What does that mean? It means a true Christian has to have, number 1, true belief. True Christian has to have true belief. You cannot get the doctrine of Christ wrong and still be a Christian, right? And I kind of beat on this a little bit on Sunday. Drives me crazy, right? The latest theology survey that's hit American Christianity says that almost 50%, or right at 50% of so-called quasi-Christians, anyone within the United States that would, at least of those who participated in the survey, and there were several thousand participants, but they associated with the term Christian, and yet they denied the deity of Christ. Now, by definition, you're not a Christian if you deny the deity of Christ. And so, number 1, what's the vital sign of a believer? You have to have true belief. That doesn't mean you have to understand the deep mysteries of God in all of their parts. Because we're never going to understand fully, but there is a basic level of understanding, true belief that is necessary to be a Christian. Otherwise, you're not a Christian. And so, vital sign number one, true profession, true belief in, true truth. But number two, progression. In other words, there is to be a transformation of the life. Now, I use the word progression deliberately because, and I say this all the time, we are not perfect and we won't be till heaven. We're not looking for perfection, but we are looking for progress. In the sense that the Bible gives us no wiggle room here. If there is no change in the behavior and the lifestyle of an individual, zero change, they have never rejected their sin, they've never renounced their sin, they're not struggling with their sin, then that is a concerning thing. That if they're not changing, there must be no life. We planted, Beatlers, help me. We, as in the Beatlers and myself, several years ago, we planted, 6 trees in my front yard? 4 of them have survived. All right? I lost 2 trees. And how do you know you lost a tree? I mean, yeah, right. Well, But think about it. You study your tree, but what happens, because I was giving it I did all sorts of stuff to coax these trees to life. And 4 of them, right now, boy, you go over, they're green, they're lush, they're growing, they look great. 2 of them, they haven't grown, they're not green, they're starting to dry out. You know what I'm saying? In other words, you look at the tree, you can, with any little bit of common sense, you can discern whether there's life in that tree or not, whether it's alive or whether it's not. And one of the signs of life is that it's growing. Right? Does that make sense? And so that's the same thing with the Christian life. Now, again, let me put a caveat on that we do not all grow at the same pace. We do not all grow and produce the same amount of fruit. That depends on, a number of factors, and the book of Hebrews is going to talk about that. It's going to talk about your understanding of the Word, your study, how seriously you pursue the Scriptures, how seriously you're in church. He says Christians that cut themselves off from church, says they're not going to be growing. He talks about it in chapter 10. And so the point is, there's various ways that you and I can engage in the Christian life in order to pursue growth. But there must be growth. There must be some flicker, some evidence of life in the fact that someone is convicted over sin, that they're at least struggling with sin. I'm not looking for perfection, but if you're at least struggling and you say, I don't want to sin anymore, okay, that's good. That's a sign of life. That shows, okay, there's evidence. That's a green leaf that's just popped out, right? There's a bud right there. Oh, praise the Lord. You see what I'm saying? So, but true life will evidence itself with true profession, true progression. But then lastly, perseverance. And that is the word or the concept that's surfacing in our verse. Verse 6, it says, we are of his household if we hold fast the confidence and rejoicing of the hope firm to the end. In other words, perseverance means that you believe continually without apostasy. Now, let me again put a caveat on that. That does not mean that you don't have bad days, that you don't have times where you doubt, that you question. And people sometimes feel guilty about doubting, and yet think of it this way. I kind of find it fascinating. Define it this way. Doubt is half belief. That's what doubt is. In other words, you want to believe, but you're kind of, you're trying to find some mental footing, and you're kind of trying to find a reason to believe. And, there's nothing wrong with that in the sense that if you're still open to hearing the message, to pursuing the truth. All of us, to one degree or another, at some point in your life, you're going to have some nagging doubts about things because your theology is going to be tested. And what you think to be true about God is going to be tested in real life. And now you got to figure it out. Oh, do I really believe that about? Is God really good all the time? Is that a really true statement? You see what I'm saying? You got a thought?
I was thinking about the guy that said to Jesus, I believe, please help me with my unbelief.
Excellent. Amen. Yeah, perfect illustration. The man who's, Jesus comes to him and he says, hey, Well, Jesus says, do you believe I can heal you? Perform the miracle. And he says, well, I believe, but help my unbelief. Exactly. And the idea, I'm not saying that we're always stalwart, never shaken, unshakable, solid in our faith. No, you're going to have down times. You're going to have hard times. You're going to have trials. That's the point of a trial, right? Is to test our faith, to grow our faith, to stretch our faith. So you're going to experience doubts. You're going to experience hardship. There's going to be some ups and downs. That's inevitable. But you continue belief in the sense that you don't apostatize. Now, we'll define that with more clarity in the text because he uses the term apostasy later in chapter 3. All right? So we'll get to that. But this idea is part and parcel to being a true believer. Let me put it this way. All right. Note that this is not earning salvation, but evidencing salvation. Some people misread this and they say, wait, am I earning my salvation by holding fast to the end? No, you're not earning salvation. You're evidencing salvation. In other words, let me put it this way. A real believer is one who presently believes. No matter your experience in the past, if you do not currently believe, you are by definition not a believer. That makes sense? In other words, apostasy, and I'll hold my thunder on that, but apostasy, let me give you a preview. Apostasy, apostasis in Greek, it means to stand away from. It means to stiff arm, to resist, to walk away, to back away, to reject, to renounce. And so this is not a faltering, halting faith, like, oh, I want to believe, but I'm struggling. Help my unbelief. It's not that. Apostasy is a rejection of Christianity. It's the turning of the back, walking away from God and saying that whole thing is, a lie. It's a myth or, foo young Christianity or whatever, they say. That is apostasy means it's a pretty emphatic word. All right. And when someone apostatizes, then that is evidence that they are not a believer. In fact, to put it another way, true belief begins but does not cease. It can grow, it can stretch, it can wane, it can falter, it can halt, but it does not stop. True belief will not cease. Believing that ceases was never true belief to begin with. That makes sense? So I'm laying this foundation now because as we work our way through this text, and then we get to not just this warning passage, but the next one is the one that most people really struggle with, is the one, the tail end of chapter 5 into chapter 6. And we're like, whoa, we got some rough waters ahead, so stay tuned. But I'm laying a foundation of what it means, to have the life signs. What are the vital signs of a believer? What does it look like to be a believer? And what is the scripture actually declaring? And so thoughts on that, questions before I launch off in the next section? We will go on and explain that further as we go, but yeah, thought? I'm sorry, say it again. That's right, absolutely. Scads of verses on that, but Philippians 1:6 is kind of the go-to. He who has begun a good work in you will complete it, right? And the idea, and did you all hear what Catherine said? She just made the point that true faith is a work of God, and it's a promise. He's going to continue. He's that idea of the Father, kind of getting ahead of myself, but in Hebrews 12, he's going to use this illustration, that he says, you might run from God for a while, but if you're a true child of God, what's the Father going to do to his child? He's going to chasten. He's going to come after that child. He's going to chasten and try and get that child back. He says, but if there is no chastening hand of God, what does he label you in that passage? A bastard and not a son. He says, you're not a legitimate son. You are not of the family of God. And so, exactly what Catherine said, true belief won't cease. Why? Because God's not going to let it cease. He's going to keep coming after us. You know what I'm saying? It's excellent. Good insight there. Absolutely, absolutely. And Hebrews is going to confront us with that reality. Because are there people who have, again, look at those three signs of life, vital signs. Let me kind of back up to them there. But out of those three vital signs, are there people, have you met people that have true belief? In other words, they are orthodox. They believe in the deity of Christ, the bodily resurrection, inspiration of the scripture, the virgin birth. They believe in the Trinity. I've met a lot of people that are orthodox in their belief, but they are not Christians. You know what I'm saying? Because they have not, for any variety of reasons, but sometimes they grew up in a Christian home, perhaps. They know the answers to the Bible questions, right? They know what they're supposed to say. But have they really owned that? Is it theirs? It's not it needs to be a personal decision. And it happens a lot. And we got to be careful of that. Yes, sir.
Would you say apostasy is the same thing as either grieving the Holy Spirit or the unpardonable sin?
So, yes. I think their short answer to that is yes, it would be the same as the unpardonable sin. Depending on how you define the grieving of the Spirit, if a person's an unbeliever, they don't have this Spirit. And so and people will go back and forth on defining that, but typically that one is reserved for a Christian who possesses the Spirit's indwelling them, but they're resisting the working of the Spirit, the conviction of the Spirit, etc. So they're grieving the Spirit. But an unbeliever, an apostate is an unbeliever. In my theology, now there's people that will disagree with that, but this is my understanding of it. And we'll develop this as we go through the book of Hebrews. But let me just throw this one out there. But 1 John 2:19, right? This one's like my go-to almost all the time on this idea. In 1 John 2:19, let me read 18 and 19. It says this: "Little children, it is the last time, as you have heard that Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists, whereby we know that it is the last time. They went out from us," get this, "they went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have no doubt continued with us. But they went out, that they might be made manifest that they were not all of us." All right, and I don't know of a verse that puts it clearer than that. That a genuine apostate is someone who is revealing eventually that they were never true believer to begin with, if that makes sense. But does that answer your question? All right, boy. Good question. And we will revisit these thoughts multiple times. Hebrews is going to afford us many opportunities for this. But any other thoughts on that? I don't want to slow you down. Okay, everyone's good. All right, speak now or forever hold your peace. All right, so let's re-advance here, and what I'd like to do is and I'm running low on time, but let me introduce you to the next section, verses 7 to 19. I want you to get the big thought flow down, okay? The hinge point is verse 6, where he says, "You are of the household of God if you hold fast to the profession, rejoicing, unto the end." He says, but he then is going to shift to give us a rather firm, kind of urgent warning to not be like the wilderness generation. And what he's going to do, here's the thought flow of this next section. He's going to quote Psalm 95, verses 7 to 11. And he's going to do that in verses 7 to 11 of our text. All right? So in verse 7 to 11, he's going to quote Psalm 95. Then, based upon that, he's going to make an application. He's going to give us a critical warning. And that's verses 12 and 13. He's then going to review the condition that he just gave. That's why I say verse 6 is the hinge point, because he repeats it almost verbatim in verse 14. Does that make sense? That's clearly the emphasis of this chapter, is he's going to review that condition that we are of the household of God if we hold fast. And then he says, in verse 15 to 18, he's going to clarify that condition a little bit further. He's going to give us an interesting kind of logical thought flow in order to arrive at his conclusion, which is verse 19. That's why, like I said, this is all one pretty tight thought flow, logical unit here. But verse 19 is going to be his conclusion. And we can just read it right now. But notice he says, "So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief." So he is going to talk about the nature of unbelief. He's going to use the illustration of the wilderness generation in order to describe or illustrate what unbelief looks like. And then basically warn us, don't be that way. Don't be unbelieving. All right? So that's kind of the big ideas of where we're heading. And let's go ahead and see, again, how far we can make it. Turn in your Bibles to Psalm 95. All right? Just quickly. And as you're on your way there, let me just highlight that it's not a coincidence that the author quotes Psalm 95. In fact, it is incredibly strategic. Why? Because Psalm 95 was used liturgically for nearly every Sabbath synagogue service. Therefore, the original readers of the book of Hebrews that are Jews, and many of them would have been very familiar with the normal synagogue service, the original readers of the book of Hebrews would have been deeply acquainted with Psalm 95. All right, the point is this was a well-known psalm used liturgically in the synagogue. And so he is appealing to a psalm that is largely common knowledge amongst most of his audience. All right, that's the point. Now, as we go and we read this psalm, let me just tell you, and again, if you want the whole lecture, we gave a whole hour to Psalm 95 in our Psalter series. It's up on our website if you want the review. But just in a nutshell, what is Psalm 95 about? Well, we don't know who wrote it. The author is unclear, but the function is pretty clear. As we read it, it has this really simple thought flow. Look at verses 1 and 2. It says, "O come, let us sing unto the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving and make a joyful noise unto him with psalms." In other words, verses 1 to 2 is your call to worship. The psalmist is calling his audience to worship God. He says, let us sing. Let's make a joyful noise. Verse 3 and following, down to verse 7, he gives us the cause for worship. In other words, he's inviting us to worship, but why? What's the incentive to worship? Verse 3, "For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. In his hand are the deep places of the earth. The strength of the hills is his also. The sea is his, and he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand." Pause there. So that section is giving you a pretty simple thought flow. And we could dissect it further, but we've already done that in the past. He's basically giving you the cause for worship. Why would we worship God? Because he's the creator. He's the sustainer of everything. Everything that we are and have comes from his hand. Why wouldn't we worship him? Right? That's the incentive that is given. But then there's the warning, or what you might call the corruption to worship. The last phrase of verse 7 down to the end of the psalm lists this. He says, "Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your heart, as in the provocation, and as in the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my work. 40 years long was I grieved with this generation, and said, It is a people that do err in their heart, and they have not known my ways, unto whom I swear in my wrath, that they should not enter into my rest." Boom, psalm's over. That's kind of it's like, well, that's a great ending. But what's the point? He's inviting you to worship. He's giving you the incentive why we worship. What is the cause for our worship? Because God is great. God is awesome. He is the creator. He's the redeemer. And then he warns us. He says, what can ruin your worship? What can corrupt your worship? What would stop you from worshiping? Rebellion. He says, don't be like that generation that came out of Egypt in the Exodus that refused to obey God. They didn't believe God. They provoked him for 40 years. They rejected him. He says, and then of course, they ultimately inherited God's wrath when he says, God swears an oath. And he says, I swear in my wrath that they will not enter my rest. He says, I'm not letting them into the promised land. All right, so it's a pretty powerful psalm when you think about as it stands on its own right. Inviting us to worship God, giving us why, but then warning us. Don't reject him like that wilderness generation did and received wrath. All right, so this psalm is the perfect psalm for our author. All right, do you see how Hebrews harnesses this so beautifully? Now, as you're on your way back to Hebrews, let me make this simple observation. Some scholars see a rather specific parallel between the wilderness generation and the original audience to the book of Hebrews. And this might be coincidence or it might be intentional on the part of the author. Just as Israel rejected God for 40 years in the wilderness, the generation of Israel in the New Testament had rejected the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, not quite, if we get our dates right, but almost for 40 years. By the time the book of Hebrews was written, then, and again, and we debate on the date, and we already talked about that, but it depends on who the author is and when you date the book. But even if it's Paul and he writes it late in his life, as I am persuaded, then it's still almost 40 years, not quite. It's 30 plus, 30, 35 plus. But the point is, some scholars say, hey, there's an interesting parallel here. That when Hebrews is written, he's speaking to his audience that for, what did Psalm 95 say? For 40 years, they provoked me in the wilderness. And then I said, enough's enough. They're not going in. And the author of Hebrews might well be saying, okay, buddies, listen up. It's been almost 40 years since Christ came, died, ascended into glory. Don't put it off any longer unless maybe you can't enter into his rest. Does that make sense? Do you see the parallel he's building? It's pretty powerful when you think about it. It's kind of potent. But after he quotes Psalm 95, are you back there in Hebrews 3? I got just a few minutes. After he quotes Psalm 95 in verses, let's go and reread that. But he quotes the psalm that we just read in verses 7 to 11, all right? He says, wherefore, as the Holy Ghost says, and we could take a little excursus there, on inspiration, our author here believes the Holy Ghost wrote Psalm 95. All right? So don't get me started on inspiration. It's really important, and we'll be here all night. But as the Holy Ghost says, and then he quotes Psalm 95, today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts, as in the provocation, in the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my works, for how long? 40 years. He might be drawing attention to that 40 mark, but, we're kind of reading between the lines there. Verse 10, wherefore I was grieved with that generation and said, they do always err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swear in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. So he quotes Psalm 95. Now read verse 12 and 13. He's going to apply Psalm 95. He says, take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. So notice this, all right? Do you see the thought flow? After quoting Psalm 95, what the author is going to do in the next couple of verses, verse 12 and 13, he's going to apply the passage to his audience with a contemporary warning. And his warning is, of course, to beware of the danger of apostasy. He says, take heed, beware, according to some translations. The idea is be alert to this danger, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. That's the idea of apostasy, departing from the living God. You turn your back and you walk away. He says, beware of the danger of apostasy. Now, again, I've kind of already made this point, but it's rather dramatically made here in this verse. Note how the departing from the living God, according to our author, is considered one and the same as rejecting Christ. All right? This is an interesting statement regarding the deity of Christ, is it not? In other words, he says, don't forsake the living God. But according to the whole book of Hebrews, what's he urging? What's he arguing for? Trusting in Christ. So if you walk away from Christ, he says you departed from the living God. Does that make sense? So it's actually a pretty potent passage on the deity of Christ. It's I think it's pretty awesome, actually. And also notice how appropriate it is in addressing his Jewish audience, right? Because when you think about this, he says to beware of the deceitfulness of sin. And notice how appropriate that is to the original audience, because it would be easy, and we've already said this, but think about it just for a moment. It would be easy to think that walking away from Christianity and returning to Judaism wouldn't be that big of a deal. It's the same God, isn't it? What's the big deal about remaining in the temple, etc.? In other words, try to put yourself in that original audience and think through that. What thoughts might be going through your mind to justify leaving Christ and going back to Judaism? Well, it's the same God, right? It's the same God who promised the Messiah. So we're still kind of being faithful to the living God, aren't we? We worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's the living God. He's the God of the burning bush. He's the living God. But what the author of Hebrews is saying is if you reject Christ, who is the Logos, the Word, the greatest revelation of the living God, he says, then you are rejecting the living God. He's not giving them the wiggle room there. Do you see? He's like, you can't walk away from Christ and call yourself faithful to God. You are rejecting the living God by rejecting Christ. And so he tells them to beware of the deceitfulness of sin. Don't be deceived. And sin, we could get lost in this. Sin is so deceitful, isn't it? It's so good at lying to us and twisting our minds. And we rationalize sin so well. And it's dangerous. And that's the whole point. He's saying, don't go there. And what's the antidote, by the way? And then I'm going to be out of time, so we have to end with this. What's the antidote according to this passage? Look at verse 12 and 13 again. Let's reread this. He says, take heed, so beware, be alert to this danger, my brethren. What danger? That there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief. He says, if there is anyone that has an unbelieving heart, he says that will make them depart from the living God. He says that is the worst possible danger, is to walk away from the living God. So he says, brethren, watch carefully, watch each other. Do you love your fellow Christians if they claim to be a Christian and they are walking away from Christ? Have you ever done this? This is where I could get really fired up, right? Because I've done this and it breaks my heart every time. Have you ever had to go and talk to an apostate Christian? Someone that you love them and you thought they were a believer, and they might be. Maybe they'll come back to God in time before they die, and they'll evidence their true faith, but they're walking away, and you have to go and confront them. And you have to say, whoa, what is going on here? But I'm getting ahead of myself, but that is the antidote. Look at verse 13. How do we watch one another to make sure we aren't departing from the living God, that there isn't a fraud in our midst that's going to run away from God? He says, exhort one another, how often? Daily. And this is where, again, this is so important, to have fellow Christians in our lives. And influential Christians in our lives. People that we let into our lives. And not just show up once a week, once a month, or once a year on holidays, to church and keep those Christians at an arm's length away. No, that is dangerous. Because when we isolate ourselves as a Christian, we are begging for a fall. We're begging for destruction. He says we need daily intervention. And then he builds that off the quotation. He says, verse 13 again, he says, but exhort one another daily while it is called today. That's the quote. He's alluding back to Psalm 95. Remember what the author said. He says, today hear his voice and don't harden your heart. So he's like, we need to daily hear the call of God through the word, through Christians, fellow Christians. He says, exhort one another daily while it's called today. Why? Lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Let me end with this, but You've all been there, and if you haven't seen this, you will. Just stick around Christianity long enough, you'll see this. And if you don't stick around Christianity, then I'm going to come knock on your door, okay? So, and you should knock on one another's door. We need to be, keeping each other on task here. But have you ever seen someone that just decides to kind of drift? And they're not, they don't take a posture of rebellion. They're not mean or nasty about it. They just kind of drift. And they get into sin, and they fall into sin. And when you're in sin and you like it and you don't want to give it up, the last place you want to be is church, right? Because all these people you feel guilty around them, and you don't want to be around them. You don't want to hear what they have to say. And we've been deceived that the sin is better than being with the saints. And so we say, all right. But then what happens is he says, you can become hardened. You remember what that word means? I talked about it a while back. I've talked about it a couple times. You know what a callus is? A callus on your skin? That's the word that's used here when it uses the word hardened. And I remember when I started weightlifting with my dad. I was 12 years old. My dad, he's a big weightlifter. He's always been a weightlifter. And he was always into exercise. And I was just chomping at the bit to go hang out with my dad and be with him. And he said, no, not till you're 12. And so, he just set that line in the sand. So I went at 12. And I just loved being, lifting with my dad. But I soon discovered what calluses are. You know what I'm saying? You pick up that barbell, that dumbbell, and, whatever weight you're using, and you start pushing, you start rubbing. And, it starts just with a mild irritation, right? You know what I'm saying? And your skin kind of turns red, and you're like, it kind of burns a little bit, and you're like, ouch, And then you're like, okay, and then you keep going, and if you don't stop, it then starts blistering. It like kind of pusses out, and it gets kind of nasty looking. But then you keep going. What happens? You pop that blister, it heals over a little bit, and then all of a sudden, your body, as a reaction to your constant use and rubbing of that part of your body responds by adding layers of skin with no nerve endings. It's a dead skin. There's no feeling there. And your body it's a response of your body to try and numb the pain. And so it layers all this, these layers of skin. And so now you can go and, do whatever with my hands. It doesn't hurt because it's all calloused up. Well, that is a pretty potent image to what can happen to us spiritually speaking. When someone falls into sin and then they don't, get out of that sin, but they stay there. And at first, when you are walking with God and then you fall, that hurts, doesn't it? You know what I'm saying? It hurts. You're like, oof, shouldn't have done that. But rather than getting out of that sin, if we go back to that sin, what happens? It hurts a little bit less the next time. And then it hurts a little bit less the next time. And and before long, if you're not careful, you're going to develop a calloused heart to the point that you will no longer experience conviction. That when you sin, it doesn't bother you because sin is now normal. You have normalized sin in your life. And the author of Hebrews says that is a dangerous place to be. And he says, don't go there. Because if you continue on and you are deadened to sin in all of its forms, he says, you may well be evidencing that you're not a true believer, that you are an apostate, that you are walking away. He says, you're walking away without any feeling of remorse. He says, that is not a good sign. You see where he's going with that? So how do we keep a soft heart, a tender heart? That our conscience is pricked and it hurts when we sin and we're like, ouch. And then we get right with God and we maintain that soft, tender heart. How do we do that? The author of Hebrews is going to give us lots of tips along the way, but here's this big one in this text. He says, you need to daily exhort one another to love and good works. He says we need to be having, and I use the word a lot, accountability, where we have friends, Christians, family members, part of the Christian family, brothers and sisters in Christ that know me well enough to spot when I'm not doing right. to confront me on it. And then tell me, Jeff, man, what? Put your head back on straight. You know what I'm saying? Do the right thing. And I'm telling you, it's a potent source in our lives. It's a powerful resource, and we need it. But I'll be done preaching for now. All right, I'm out of time. Questions, comments, thoughts that you have? Yeah, Catherine. Absolutely. No, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm understanding your question correctly, both of those dynamics are at play in the book. He's obviously making a personal appeal to individuals who are listening. He'll make that clear as he goes through. He addresses his audience a couple of times very specifically, and it seems, and he does call us to a personal choice. But as Catherine pointed out, this is a fascinating other dynamic to the book, is that he's also speaking to the nation of Israel at large, where he's giving them a critical warning and basically saying, don't reject Christ. Because, and think about this, and nearly everyone, even depending on whether you think Paul wrote it or not, most people will date Hebrews, 9 out of 10 scholars will date Hebrews before AD 70. Because, for lots of reasons, and we've talked about them before. But with that said, the nation of Israel is heading for disaster. Why? Because they rejected Christ. And Jesus himself, in the book of Matthew, recall, in his earthly ministry, he predicted that because they rejected him, what was going to happen? The nation was going to be destroyed. The fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 was the fulfillment of that. And so, just what Jesus did in warning the nation, and he's saying, oh, don't go there, don't, and he warns them and he predicts what's going to happen with the destruction of Jerusalem. The author of Hebrews, in a sense, is making a similar appeal. Absolutely, to the nation at large, that, hey, whoa, listen up. And then do you remember that footnote to history? Do you remember this? Do you remember when Rome, and I'll try not to take long with this, I promise. When Rome surrounded the city of Jerusalem, they started sieging the city, AD 66, 67. They then broke the siege temporarily, and they left the city. And what did all the Christians do? They ran to a city called Pella. It's a well-known fact of history. Josephus talks about this. And they ran across Jordan River over to Pella. Why? Because Jesus made a prediction. He says, when you see the city surrounded, flee to the mountains. That's what they did. But those Jews who did not believe in Jesus, nor his claims to be a prophet, so they didn't listen to his warning, they stayed in the city of Jerusalem. And what happened to them? The Romans came back. They reconducted the siege, and they slaughtered hundreds of thousands, yea, millions of Jews. Slaughtered or captured them and sold them into slavery, just like Jesus predicted. And so there is a really fascinating national Jewish, nation dynamic going on here. Absolutely. And I think we should be dating Hebrews right around, 66 to 68 is when we should date it. Because Paul, of course, that's my terminus, but I think Paul, he dies in 68. So that's the latest it could have been written. But that's in the middle of the Jewish war. We'll revisit that concept a couple more times because it is fascinating. The more you know about that first century history, Hebrews just kind of comes to life. Yeah, you got a thought?
So, Scripture tells us that there'll be a remnant in the Jewish nation.
That's right.
Are they Jesus Christian believing Jews remnant? Or are they just 100% hardcore Jewish remnant?
Good question. There'll actually be some of both. If I read Revelation and Zechariah, right, if I'm reading them right, then there'll be both. When Jesus comes back, there will be some holdout Christians that have survived the tribulation, the last 7 years of human history, But there will also be some Jews that are still Jewish in all sense. They don't believe in Jesus as Messiah. And then, remember, this is Zechariah 12. It says, when he descends in the clouds, they will look upon him whom they had pierced, and then they will weep as one weeps for a firstborn son. In other words, I think at that moment, they will recognize, oh, this is the Messiah that we have so long rejected. And so that at least implies that there will be Jewish, Jews, Judaistic Jews, maybe a better term, that will be surviving, all the way up until the coming of Christ. Yeah. Excellent question. Whew. That's a fun dynamic, to study the book from that perspective. Did that answer your question, by the way? Or kind of? Did I take a wrong turn somewhere? Yeah, Simone?
I was just going to say, too, that we're talking about people that kind of backslide, they're not feeling about it, they kind of slide and let things go and
Right.
kind of distance themselves from the church. I've seen it happen when churches split up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my pastor's not there, they ran my pastor out, so I'm not going to go back to that church anymore. I just look at TV and listen to the videos. I don't need to go there.
Right.
And that's heading in the wrong direction as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. It's dangerous. And we are in an era, and we'll end with this, but we are in a day and age where the local church is under attack, obviously, not just from our governments and obviously there's an attack on that front. But I'm saying there's an attack from within, where people, Christians, they no longer assign value or importance to a local church. They say, I can watch YouTube and I go to church. And it's like, okay, is that, can you do that, in the short term or whatever? Sure. Can that be an asset? Absolutely. But is that a church? Not according to the New Testament definition. A church means an assembly. You got to get together with fellow Christians. Exactly. And anyways, I got a soapbox on that one too. It's important. It's important. And it's undermined. Oh, it's being attacked hardcore right now. And a lot of Christians are walking away from the church. Yeah, it's sad. All right, boy, great topics. Let's close in prayer, and we'll shut her down for tonight, and we'll pick it up here next week. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the privilege to study, to learn, to grow. We ask that you would indeed help us to learn, to study, to grow, that when we come together, that we read the Scripture, that we discover its meaning, that we attempt then to apply it to our lives. God, help us. Please help us to not simply be hearers of the word, as James puts it, but to be doers of the word, to perhaps hear your truth and recognize where we may be deficient in our lives, and Lord, to come to you in humble repentance and embrace your forgiveness and your grace and seek to change for your glory. Lord, help us as believers to hold one another accountable. Lord, I thank you for the Christian friends in my life that have in so many ways shaped who I am. And I thank you so much for that. And I pray that you would help us to be influenced and to be that influence in the lives of fellow believers. God, help us. Because we do. We live in an age of apostasy. We are watching people walk away from the Christian church in droves. And it is concerning. It is inevitable to one degree. We understand, if we understand our prophecy correctly. But Lord, it breaks our hearts to watch so many walk away from Christ. Or so many just neglect Christ and the church, and as a result become hardened in their hearts. And God, help us. Help us not to fall into these pitfalls. But for your glory, give us your grace, your convicting spirit, that we would indeed have a soft and tender heart that responds to you. So, Father, thank you for these truths. Thank you for these friends that we can gather around here together with to study, to think, to pray. Lord, what a glory it is. Bless us now as we go our separate ways. May we live this week more faithful to you, Lord, as a result of our time together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.